Well, hi there. This is a penguin. Well, not really. Penguins are extinct. But since these look so much like penguins, and since most people don't know about true penguins, odds are that this is the only thing that you have ever known as a penguin. And I'll point you to a video of ours that talks more about the true penguins at the end of this video. But today, I want to talk mostly about these false penguins. All of them. Every species. Because as much as they may not be true penguins, they are some of the most wonderful and amazing birds on the planet. Heck, I like them more than true penguins. And there are only 18 or so species. But how many can you name? So let's crack into these false penguins, all 18 species, and how they're related. And if we have time at the end, maybe we can talk about a few crazy species that are extinct now, but might be even cooler than any members of this family alive today. And the family that contains all of the false penguins is the family Sphenicidae, which shouldn't be confused with the genus Penguinus, the true penguins. But I will henceforth refer to false penguins simply as penguins. So from now on, when I say penguin, I want you to know that I'm referring to the false penguins of the family Sphenicidae. Sphenicidae essentially means wedge, in reference to the wedge-like shape of their wings. And I want to talk for a minute about those wings, because penguins are notoriously flightless. But what they do underwater is not so different from flight at all. In some ways, perhaps even more spectacular. And sometimes, they do end up flying through the air. How they accomplish this feat might just be the most spectacular part of all. You see, penguins, especially for birds, are extremely heavy. Emperor penguins are just a touch over 1 meter tall, so many couldn't quite ride Space Mountain, but they weigh more than a golden retriever. That's the same height as the Philippine eagle, the largest eagle, but well over 5 times as heavy. There are a couple of things that account for this weight. For one thing, living in some of the coldest places on Earth. And being a bit more robust lowers the amount of surface area to volume that they have. Along with a layer of blubber for insulation, this means that they conserve heat better than would a thinner, blubberless bird. But blubber is buoyant. And for a bird that dives to great depths, buoyancy can make life very energetically expensive. So in addition to this blubber, which is heavy, just lighter than water, they also have very heavy, dense bones. I've lifted the wing of a penguin, and where most bird wings feel like they're made out of nothing at all, but maybe toothpicks and styrofoam, this thing felt like it might have some lead in it. It was surprisingly heavy. So they are thick and blubbery with very dense bones, which is great for diving and swimming, but not so good for climbing out of the water through a hole in the ice with no hands and only stupid little feet. If you're ever going to get out of the ocean, it will be because you are able to launch yourself through the air. And the way that this is done is bonkers. Today's video is sponsored by our friends at BetterHelp. Sometimes it can feel like life just keeps getting more stressful, more busy. The world moves fast, expectations can be high, and sometimes just facing the day can be overwhelming. On top of that, relationships, whether with family, friends, or partners, can create complexity that's difficult to navigate. You might have questions like, why do I always feel like I'm not good enough? Why do small things turn into big arguments? Why do I panic when someone gets too close? These thoughts can keep us up at night, making us feel stuck. But here's the good news. You don't have to figure it all out alone. Our partners at BetterHelp are here to help you navigate life's big questions and stresses. BetterHelp is an online therapy platform that connects you with a licensed therapist from the comfort of your home. Whether you need help working through relationship struggles, managing stress, or just understanding your own emotions, therapy can make a real difference and give you a stronger foundation. Getting started is easy. Just fill out a quick questionnaire and BetterHelp will match you with a therapist tailored to your needs. If it's not the right fit, you can switch therapists at no extra cost. Taking care of your mental health is just as important as taking care of your physical health. If you're ready to take that step, click the link in the description, betterhelp.com/ClintsReptiles, to get 10% off your first month. That's betterhelp.com/ClintsReptiles. You deserve support, and you don't have to do it alone. If you've ever had an underwater view of penguins jumping in, you've probably noticed the awesome looking bubble trails that they leave in their wake. And if you've ever stopped to ponder why they produce a bubble trail when they first dive in, I would wager that you were able to figure it out. These birds live on land much of the time. They have air under their feathers. When they dive in, much of that air escapes. And this is all true and interesting. But look at these penguins returning to shore potentially after weeks, months, or even years at sea. What do you notice? They still have a giant trail of bubbles? You could probably sit and ponder on that one for about as long as you like without being able to make sense of it. But good news! I'm going to explain it to you. Air is, as it turns out, less dense and has lower kinematic viscosity than does water. In other words, it's easier to move fast through air than water. As such, when an emperor penguin needs to fly out of the water to get onto the ice, it begins by surfacing elsewhere for a while and collecting a considerable amount of air under its feathers. It then uses special muscles to close off the feathers and trap the air inside. Then, with the air trapped in its feathers, the penguin will dive down, which not only gives them distance to build speed for their epic flight, but also, as air compresses under pressure much more than water, it causes the air to become highly condensed under the feathers. And the muscles move the feathers to tighten over the air and keep it even more securely contained within them. In other words, the air is now trapped in spaces far too small to contain the air if the pressure were less, like that experienced, say, near the surface. What this means is that as they surface and the air begins to expand within these compartments that are increasingly too small to contain it, it pours out of the feathers, surrounding the penguin in a lubricating slipstream that reduces drag and enables it to swim far faster than would otherwise be possible. And they come flying out of the water and onto land, or ice. Remarkable. Emperor penguins, along with their closest relatives, the king penguins, make up the genus Aptenodytes, collectively known as the great penguins, the most distantly related genus of penguins in the family Sphinicidae, and the largest and arguably greatest members of the family alive today, though by no means the largest that have ever existed. In addition to being larger than other penguins, they're also very unique looking from other penguins, and are probably the most iconic of penguins. And it isn't too surprising that they're very distinctive, as this lineage appears to have separated from the rest of the penguins around 40 million years ago. It's easy to recognize a great penguin by their size, as well as somewhat unique beak shape and the orange or white spots on the back of their neck and head right around where their ears are located, and the orange on the front side of their necks as well. Their coloration reminds me kind of an orca that got a bit of a spray tan on its neck. I've always been able to recognize a great penguin almost immediately. What has not always been so easy for me is distinguishing between the two species. However, this isn't really all that difficult either. King penguins are smaller, standing at most about a meter tall and weighing no more than about 18 kilos, or about 40 pounds. Emperor penguins can easily be over 1.2 meters in height and can weigh over 45 kilos, or about 100 pounds, which makes it not only the largest extant penguin, but the 5th largest extant bird, the 4 larger all being in the Paleognathi. So it is the largest extant member of the Neognathi. Of course, there have been far larger birds in the past. We just covered them last Dinosaur December, if you want to check that out. But side by side, it isn't difficult to tell a king and emperor penguin apart just by their sizes. Of course, in nature, you're unlikely to find them side by side. Emperor penguins are found on and right around Antarctica. King penguins are found farther north, on subantarctic islands and in the surrounding waters. So knowing how close you are to Antarctica can be a strong giveaway. But in addition to these size and geographical differences, their coloration is also pretty different. The basic pattern is very similar, but king penguins tend to be far more gray on their dorsal sides than emperors, and they have much more orange on them overall, especially on the spots by their ears and on their beaks. And given that kings are the 2nd largest penguin in the world, and when you see them it might not be in the wild, it's still pretty good to be able to recognize them by coloration. Both of these penguins are incredible divers, reaching depths of 300 meters, like 1,000 feet for kings, and a staggering 535 meters, which is like 1,755 feet for emperors. This is facilitated by modifications to their hemoglobin, their solid bones, and to the ability to shut down non-essential organ function while diving. We could easily make an entire video just about these guys. But we have a lot of other mostly southern hemisphere creatures that look like penguins left to discuss. After the great penguins, the next genus to diversify from the rest were the brush-tailed penguins of the genus Picocellus, whose lineage seems to have diversified about 38 million years ago, so just a couple of million years after the great penguins. And this genus holds a special place in my heart because it was one of these three species that accepted me as one of their own not so many years ago. As their common name would suggest, these guys do have long tails that have long feathers that often fan out and look very brush-like. And their scientific name means rump-legged, probably because they often use those feathers for a stool to rest upon. Despite this clear similarity, the three species do all look pretty distinctive from one another. Adelaide penguins max out generally at around 73 centimeters, around 29 inches in length, and weigh no more than about 8.2 kilos or a touch over 18 pounds. So they, like all extant penguins, are smaller than the great penguins, but not small. They occupy a very similar range to that of the emperor penguin, but with an even larger range, in fact the largest range of any penguin. But unlike emperor penguins, which are the only Antarctic penguins that attempt to breed in the winter, Adelaide penguins breed in the summer, which makes a lot more sense. They're pretty easy to distinguish from other tail tripod penguins because their head is entirely black, except for a white ring around their eyes, and their beak is largely covered in feathers. If you were to confuse them with any of the other two species, it would be with my people, the Gentoo penguins. You won't confuse them, but it would be the easier brush bottom to mistake for an Adelaide, as they also have a black head with white eye rings. They don't have a feathered beak though, and their beak has a lot more orange on it. Plus they have big bushy white Santa Claus eyebrows, which connect in the center like a pair of headphones. They're also taller, the third tallest of all penguins at as much as about 90 centimeters, but only weighing around 8.5 kilos. They're a little heavier, but not much heavier. But they can probably get away with being a bit leaner for their height because they live farther north, around and on the southern tip of South America, like southern Argentina and Chile. They just don't need as much insulation. Plus, they are the fastest swimming birds on the planet, at least underwater, reaching speeds of 36 kilometers or roughly 22 miles an hour. So they are built for speed. The third member of the genus is one that you are highly unlikely to confuse with either of the other two, or any other penguin for that matter, and that is the very appropriately named Chinstrap penguin. Because it looks like it's wearing one of those helmets that you can get away with wearing if you're in a biker gang, but you want more than a bandana to protect your brain. They also have a black bill, but without feathers, and yellowish eyes surrounded by a black ring and white faces. There's no reason to mix them up with any of the penguins that we've looked at so far at the very least. But the dead giveaway is definitely the Chinstrap. They're about the same height as Adelaide penguins, maxing out at about 76 centimeters or around 30 inches, but being a slightly more northerly species, they are lighter generally, getting no larger than about 5.3 kilos, which is less than 12 pounds. Now I say more northerly, and they are, but they still do breed in the more northerly parts of Antarctica and other circumpolar regions like southern Argentina and Chile, so not too much farther north. As with most penguins, males are a bit larger than females, and as their biker gang heritage would imply, Chinstrap penguins are notoriously grumpy. I suspect that this has to do with the fact that they tend to sleep 11 hours a day, but mostly in bouts of about 4 seconds. Sometimes only one brain hemisphere at a time. So you're probably waking up at least half of their brain anytime that you interact with them. And before we go on to the rest of the penguins, I want to take a minute to explain why the wings of penguins don't cause them to freeze to death. You see, wings basically exist to provide a lot of surface area to generate lift and thrust. Penguins, being somewhat lighter than water, use them to generate thrust and push against buoyancy. Counteracting buoyancy is most of what is achieved on their upstroke, which is pretty rad. And though penguins have smaller wings than most conventionally flighted birds, the wings still provide a lot of surface area, which could mean a lot of heat loss. Most of a penguin is shaped like a feather and blubber insulated torpedo, which is a great shape for resisting heat loss. But those wings are like cooling fins. And a bird that maintains a body temperature over 38 degrees Celsius in waters that get to about -2 degrees Celsius, and air temperatures much colder than that, should find it extremely difficult to maintain such a body temperature given those cooling fins. Unless you don't send that heat to them. The problem is that wings are alive and need blood from the body to deliver oxygen and nutrients to them, which means that the wings should function like a radiator, and that's not good. However, if anybody ever designs a radiator like a penguin wing, fire them, because the penguin wing takes advantage of a structure that will be very familiar to those of you that have seen our video about the insane way that birds breathe. Because temperature gradients function very much like concentration gradients. Heat moves from areas of high temperature to areas of low temperature. And the blood vessels that deliver blood to the wing run right alongside the vessels that transport blood back from the wing. And the blood coming back from the wing is unsurprisingly much colder than the blood running to the wing. This was always going to be the case. But whereas we would expect the warm blood leaving the body to lose all of its heat in the wing and then return cold, having extracted all of the heat from the body and dumped it into the sea, or the air, from the wing, because of this countercurrent blood flow, the blood is cold before it ever gets to the wing. Because the heat from the blood going to the wing was transferred to the cold blood returning to the body from the wing. And though the blood gets colder and colder as it approaches the wing, it is always moving towards colder and colder blood returning from the wing. And there is always a temperature gradient. It would be a problem for the wing to ever get so cold that ice crystals began to form in the cells, but it doesn't need to stay much over 0 degrees Celsius to prevent that. So it's fine that the wings are cold, and the heat remains in the main body, keeping the brain and other organs operating optimally. Pretty bodacious. And that gets us to the remaining 4 genera of extant penguins, which are all more closely related to one another than they are to any of the penguins that we've discussed so far. And these 4 genera fall into 2 clades of 2 genera each. And so I'll start with the clade that includes my favorite penguin, because I've waited long enough to talk about them, as well as the only penguin I've ever seen in the wild, and the only penguin found in the northern hemisphere. At least since the true penguins went extinct. So it's a rad clade, and yet still only arguably the radder of the 2. But I'll start with my favorite penguin, which may actually be 2 species in the genus Eudyptula, the little penguins. There are many subspecies found on and around Australia and New Zealand, but there seems to still be much debate as to whether or not they are all part of the same species, or if there is a sufficient difference between the Australian little penguins and the New Zealand little penguins. But one species or 2, I love them so much. I've always known them as little blue penguins since they are the smallest penguins and they are blue. At least the Australian ones, which also like to go on little strolls on the beach with their buddies, something that the New Zealand little penguins really don't do. There are some Australian little blues in New Zealand, so don't be calling me a liar if you see them being all blue and using the buddy system. So not all are blue, but they are all small. I mean, they're only about a foot tall, maxing out at around 33 centimeters. And they only weigh around 1.5 kilos, which is less than 3.5 pounds. They're so tiny and cute. And they nest down in little burrows, unlike those penguins that we've discussed so far that either make nests out of rocks or out of their own feet. There is just something so adorable about a little blue penguin popping out of a hole and saying hi to the world. But building nests in holes and crevices is something that they have in common with their closest relatives, the 4 species of banded penguins in the genus Spheniscus, the only genus I've ever seen in the wild, and the only genus of false penguins that have crossed the equator into the realm of the true penguins. These 4 penguins would be really difficult to tell apart if you didn't know where you were in the world. Most of them are around 70 centimeters tall, with black bills and faces and a dark ring around their bellies, hence the name banded penguins, and some dark speckling on their bellies as well. But I'll start with the easiest of the 4 to identify, the smallest member of the genus, and the only sphenicid in the northern hemisphere, the Galapagos penguin, which lives, rather unsurprisingly, in the Galapagos Islands. And since the equator runs through the Galapagos Islands, and nobody told them that penguins live only in the southern hemisphere, well, this is how false penguins wound up in the realm of the true penguins. So the easiest way to identify them is by noticing if you're in the Galapagos Islands. But if you don't know, or they're in a zoological facility, then you may notice that this is a banded penguin that only stands about 50 centimeters, or about 20 inches tall, and weighs no more than about 4 kilograms, or a touch under 9 pounds. They also have the darkest coloration of the 4 species, with very little white on their throat area. The other 3 species are all found farther south. Geographically, the closest of the 3 to the Galapagos penguins are the Humboldt, or Peruvian penguins, which I had the privilege of seeing regularly when I lived in the coastal Peruvian city of Mollendo. This is a much more typically sized banded penguin, growing to around 70 centimeters, or about 28 inches long, and weighing as much as about 6 kilos, or a touch over 13 pounds. It can be rather difficult to differentiate these penguins, which are found on the coast of Peru and most of Chile, from their cousins, the Magellanic penguins, which are found in the southern half of Chile, as well as the Atlantic side of South America, all the way up to the coast of Brazil. And this can be an issue because their ranges overlap, so knowing where you are will not always tell you what you're looking at. Add to that their basic pattern is very similar, and Magellanic penguins are only a tiny bit larger, growing to around 76 centimeters in height, or around 30 inches, and weighing no more than about 6.5 kilos, or a touch over 14 pounds. But I have found a way. Humboldt penguins have a pink featherless band around most of the base of their beaks, whereas Magellanic penguins only have these pink featherless patches over their eyes. Magellanic penguins also seem to have fewer belly spots than do Humboldt penguins. And, perhaps most importantly, in addition to the band on the chest, typical of the genus as a whole, Magellanic penguins have a second band across their chest that makes it look like their dark back coloration is some sort of a cape. That pink patch over the eyes, as well as the reduced number of belly spots, are, however, something that they have in common with the final member of this genus. The good news is that the ranges of these two don't overlap at all, because the final member is the African penguin, which is found mostly in South Africa, but also all the way up the Atlantic coastline of Africa into the southern tip of Angola. And in my opinion, this is probably the prettiest member of this clade, and a species that I might get to see in the wild very soon when I go to dive with great white sharks and the scariest animal in the world, Dave Kaufman. African penguins are more the height of Humboldt penguins, but they seem to be much lighter in weight, maxing out at only around 3.5 kilos, which is under 8 pounds. So they're a bit smaller than Magellanic penguins, with overall a very similar coloration. But if size and location aren't enough differences, I have noticed that African penguins have a distinctive stripe around their beak near the tip that isn't present on any of their cousins from the Western Hemisphere. And they don't have the extra cape band of the Magellanic penguins. And that brings us to the final, and perhaps weirdest, clade of penguins, and our final 2 genera. And this whole clade is pretty distinctive. The least unique member probably being the one species in the genus Megadiptes, the yellow-eyed penguin, which lives on and around New Zealand. So you could potentially confuse it with a little penguin, but you're not going to do that. Mostly because they're way bigger than a little penguin, standing as tall as 79 centimeters, around 31 inches, and weighing as much as 8.5 kilos, which is nearly 19 pounds. But they are often not very black. In fact, some are pretty blue in color. So if you saw them from a distance, it could be easy to think that they are little penguins, unless you looked at their beaks, which are generally kind of a pink with a red tip. Or better yet, if you notice their eyes, which, as far as I can tell, are orange, not yellow, but they are surrounded by yellow feathers that then go up, forming a stripe that goes over the top of the head. Add that to the fact that everything in front of that stripe is also a bit yellow, and you just shouldn't confuse them with anything else. The reality is that if you are going to mistake a distant yellow-eyed penguin for any other penguin, it would probably be with one of their closest relatives. Possibly the most unusual of all penguins, the crested penguins of the genus Eudiptes, the last remaining genus, and the largest genus of extant penguins on Earth, with 6 or 7 different species, and the most difficult genus to tell apart. Not that you should have any trouble distinguishing the genus from any other, they have giant yellow eyebrows. And if you can name 2 crested penguins, It's probably macaroni and rockhopper penguins, which are actually 3 different species, so you're off to a good start. And the macaroni penguin is probably the most abundant penguin on Earth, so if you're only going to know one, that's a good one to know. In many ways, it looks like a pretty normal penguin. They're pretty average sized, around 70 centimeters tall and weighing around 6.5 kilos, about 14 pounds. Black with white bellies. A reddish bill, which is different from most penguins, but not that different from, say, yellow-eyed penguins. Though they are from the southern tip of South America and a bit of the northernmost parts of Antarctica, they will venture over near Africa and occasionally do end up near Australia and New Zealand. But it's unlikely that you'd ever confuse the two, because the macaroni penguin stuck a feather in each side of its cap and called it macaroni, which was kind of a slang term for anything extravagantly fashionable in the 1700s. And it does get its name from the noodles, but not because macaroni looked necessarily like macaroni noodles. Though an argument can be made that the macaroni of macaroni penguins does have a certain pasta-like appearance to it, of almost identical size and basic shape, so much so that it was long thought to be a macaroni penguin, is the royal penguin, which is found exclusively on and around Macquarie Island and its adjacent islands. In many ways, they look ridiculously similar to macaroni penguins. Some even argue that they are just a different colored population of macaroni penguins. But their white faces make it very unlikely that you would ever confuse the two. In fact, the royal penguin might be one of the most distinctive of all penguins. And that's the one easy one in this genus. Now let's take a look at the rockhoppers, because there are 2 species of rockhoppers. Southern rockhoppers are found around the southern tip of South America and south of Australia. Northern rockhoppers are found between those 2 populations, on and around islands in the southern Atlantic and Indian Oceans. Northern rockhoppers may be a bit larger, but both are somewhere around 58 centimeters tall, around 23 inches at most, and around 3.4 kilos or 7.5 pounds, though they sometimes do get a touch larger. Really, the locality is about the only way to distinguish between their species without examining their genetic material or the parasites that parasitize them. Some researchers are still skeptical about considering them to be unique species. It's nearly impossible visually, but it is much more possible to distinguish them from macaroni penguins. They're smaller, and the base of the orange or red bill is covered in black feathers, unlike the similarly colored bill of the macaroni penguin, which has an unfeathered, downturned patch of pink skin extending beneath their eyes, making them look a little grumpy. Also, the macaroni on rockhoppers is not just their yellow eyebrows, but the dark feathers on top of their heads are also long and luscious. And of course, they don't have white faces, so it's no problem distinguishing them from royal penguins. But we're not out of the woods yet. There are 3 more, and one of them looks like it just ran. It ran so far away. It just ran. It ran all night and day, but couldn't get away. And I'm not talking about Forrest Gump. I'm talking about the ever so delightful erect crested penguin. Called that for reasons that are not so difficult to understand. They're right around the same size as macaroni penguins, reaching sizes of about 70 centimeters, around 28 inches, and weighing as much as about 6 kilos, a touch over 13 pounds. They're found southwest of New Zealand in the Bounty and Antipodes Islands, as well as potentially on Campbell Island and the Auckland Islands. So geographically, not the same place as macaroni penguins. And with mouth corners that look more like rockhoppers, but without the luscious feathers on the top of their heads, as that would totally ruin their double mohawk appearance, which would be a real shame. So I think we're doing okay. We have grumpy mouths, white faces, luscious head feathers, and a flock of seagulls to help us keep things straight so far. But these last 2 are going to be tricky, so hang in there. This is the Snares penguin, which breeds on the Snares Islands off the coast of New Zealand. It's about the same size as a macaroni or an erect crested penguin, and it has the grumpy mouth corners of the macaroni penguin as well. But the macaroni penguin has a unibrow, and the Snares penguin does not. So that's a pretty great point of distinction. Which means that we have grumpy mouths, white faces, luscious head feathers, a flock of seagulls, and a unibrow to help us keep all of these straight. But if you were going to mix up a Snares penguin with any other, it probably wouldn't be a macaroni. It would be one of these. The final species of extant sphenicid, the Fiordland penguin of southern New Zealand and its neighboring islands, which looks very similar, but is smaller at around 55 centimeters, or roughly 22 inches long, and weighing rarely more than about 5 kilos, or around 11 pounds. So if you're really good at estimating sizes from a distance, then that should work. But more importantly, they lack the grumpy mouth corners of the snares and macaroni penguins. So when it comes to crested penguins, grumpy mouths, white faces, luscious head feathers, a flock of seagulls, and a unibrow should be all that you need to keep them straight. But I promised you that we would discuss a bit about the largest sphinicids that have ever existed. False penguins that were much larger than any that we have today. I'd like to just say thank you to our patrons on Patreon. These videos, I love them. They're probably my favorite videos to make, but they're also by far the most difficult videos that we make. They take a lot of time and effort, not just from me, but from our entire team. And it has been possible for us to upgrade our content to producing more and more videos of this caliber thanks to the support of our patrons on Patreon. And if you want to see this mission go forward, or you just want to see all the amazing features that we have for our patrons, please consider supporting us on Patreon. The title of the biggest sphenicid, much like the title of the biggest land carnivore that the world has ever seen, is actually held by more than one false penguin. Because the biggest is a bit of a subjective term. Big basically means large or impressive in size. But how are we measuring that? Is it the longest? In which case the 55 meter or 180 foot bootlace worm would be a bigger animal than a blue whale. Is it the most massive? In which case a rhinoceros would be roughly twice as big as a giraffe, for example. Or is it something else? I'm not sure that there is an exact answer, but the tallest sphenicid that we know to have ever existed was this. The 1.8 meter, nearly 6 foot, 90 kilo or 200 pound Anthropornis of Antarctica and New Zealand. And the heaviest was this, Pachydioptes of New Zealand, coming in at 1.6 meters but weighing as much as 100 kilos, which were both members of the subfamily Paleodiptinae, the giant penguins. Though this subfamily is likely paraphyletic, so take their relationship to one another with a grain of salt. But they were big, by whatever definition you like. And big sphenicids tend to stay out to sea longer. They're almost the dinosaur equivalent of whales, at least small toothed whales like dolphins and porpoises, whose appearance on the scene coincides with, and likely played a key role in, the extinction of these giant false penguins about 25 million years ago. But while we're on the subject of grains of salt, what do false penguins do with all of the salt that they drink? They shoot it out of their noses, like all of their closest relatives. So if you want to learn more about that, their closest relatives, or the true penguins, which are not at all their closest relatives, please check out this video right now. As always, like and subscribe, and we hope to see you real soon.
But yeah, I've always bought the off-brand mac and cheese. I haven't done a side-by-side, so...
We should do a boxed macaroni and cheese taste-off. It seems like it'd be hard to have more than 4 contestants, because you could heat them up, unless you had 2 ranges.
Yeah.
Can you imagine living that life? And then this is a nightmare I can scarcely imagine. Trying to keep 4 boxes of macaroni and cheese from boiling over simultaneously.